Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, following Sunday's talks in Saudi Arabia between the US and Ukraine, today US and Russian officials are holding talks in the same venue aimed at paving the way for a ceasefire in Ukraine. The arrest of the Istanbul mayor and opposition leader Ekrem İmamoğlu triggers some of Turkey's worst unrest in years. More than 1,100 people are reported to have been arrested. And Gaza's health ministry says more than 50,000 Palestinians have now been killed in the Israel-Hamas war, including more than 700 killed since Israel resumed its bombardment last week. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin in Saudi Arabia, where US negotiators have today been holding talks in the capital, Riyadh, talks aimed at paving the way towards an end to the fighting in Ukraine. Well, on Sunday, the US delegation met with Ukrainian negotiators, and today the US team has been meeting with Russian negotiators. Well, as well as bringing about an end to the war in Ukraine, Washington's aim is also to improve bilateral ties with Moscow. But despite these diplomatic efforts, thousands of kilometers away, the fighting continues, with both Ukraine and Russia accusing each other of launching overnight drone strikes. Let's get more now, and we can speak to Ambassador William B. Taylor, the US Chargé d'Affaires to Ukraine under President Trump, currently distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, who joins us now from Michigan. Ambassador, great to have you with us. You, of course, also served under Presidents Bush and Obama. I'd like to ask you, first of all, what your assessment is of the Trump administration's efforts to end the war in Ukraine.
So, Tom, I will say that the Trump administration has put a higher priority on ending the war than the previous administration. President Trump, as we remember, has famously said he was going to solve it, he was going to resolve it in 24 hours, which, of course, no one thought that was actually possible. But that did indicate that there's a high priority, sense of urgency to this, which we didn't have before. Previously, we were providing weapons and ammunition and intelligence, but we weren't engaged in bringing the war to an end. And President Trump is. That could be a good thing. He can bring some pressure on certainly President Putin to be able to end this war.
How does he do that? How does he exert pressure on President Putin? Because some might say he'd made a few concessions to President Putin and got none in return.
Some of his people have made some concessions already. You're exactly right, and they've got nothing in return. But President Putin really does want to come in from the cold. President Putin is isolated. He's an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court for abducting Ukrainian children. He's got sanctions on him and his economy. His civilian economy is not going well. His civilian economy is fragile, and more sanctions or even more enforcement of existing sanctions can really do bad damage, can do severe damage to the Russian economy. So President Putin wants some things from President Trump. President Trump can use that as leverage to get from President Putin a better deal than President Putin has been talking about. President Putin has been making these outlandish requests, demands, preconditions that are just not going to go anywhere with the Ukrainians or the Europeans or the Americans. So President Trump can bring some pressure.
So you're saying that the sanctions are having the intended effect when they were enacted a couple of years ago. And this, in turn, you're saying can be used as carrots to get the Russians to agree to a deal that's perhaps closer to what the Ukrainians might want out of this. Is that roughly what you're saying?
Yes, I would say carrots or sticks. Because as you indicate, the sanctions that have been on for years, and it's Europeans and Americans have these sanctions on, but they've been evaded. Those sanctions have been somewhat effective, and they have hurt the Russian economy as they were designed to do, to make it more difficult for them to be able to fund this war, this illegal war. The sanctions have done that, but they haven't stopped the war. the sanctions haven't stopped the war for a couple of reasons, but one is they haven't been fully enforced. It is possible to make these sanctions tougher, enforced more, or even additional sanctions. So that those could be the sticks. Yes, there are some carrots that if the Russians get out of Ukraine and cooperate with President Trump and President Zelensky, then there could be some sanctions relief.
Ambassador, a couple of clues emerged on the U.S. position from the White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz. During the weekend, he gave an interview in which he said that a ceasefire in the Black Sea, a sort of a maritime ceasefire, could be one of the things that comes out of the talks in Riyadh. He also talked about the lines of control. And I'm just wondering whether you think the US would agree to a deal that saw the lines of control frozen where they are now, and whether you think Ukraine would support such a deal.
Tom, the second part of your question is the important one. Would the Ukrainians agree? They are the ones that are going to be negotiating with the Russians. Maybe, yes, through the Americans. Maybe this is a shuttle diplomacy kind of a negotiation. With the Ukrainians in one room and the Russians in another. But let's be very clear, it is really a Russia-Ukraine negotiation, the Americans in the middle. But you asked the right question. Would they be willing, or would we be willing, to see the lines frozen? I think the Ukrainians would hate it. The Americans would want to see this war end, or at least this firing, this killing stop. In some just and lasting way to get to a just and lasting peace. So it may be for some period of time that these lines, the current lines, could be the ceasefire lines. You mentioned the Black Sea, and they've also talked about, of course, energy ceasefires. Both sides would agree not to fire at each other's energy sophistication system. But then they might talk about Black Sea agreements to allow exports. And then they may get to a ceasefire in the air. And finally, a broad ceasefire, which is what President Trump and President Zelensky agreed on. And President Trump presented to President Putin, and President Putin said no. He didn't want this broad ceasefire. But that's the stage. Energy, Black Sea, air, land, and then finally a full ceasefire, which would then set the stage, Tom, for real negotiations on a settlement, a final settlement.
I just want to pick up on one of the things you were saying there, Ambassador. You were saying, would the Ukrainians accept such a deal? Do you think the Ukrainians can really just turn around and say no to a deal that's presented or brokered on its behalf by the United States? Or do you think they have to accept what Washington puts in front of them?
They don't have to accept it. They do want to be as cooperative as they can with Washington, but they've shown on a couple of occasions that they're willing to say no. You may remember a couple of weeks ago, the Treasury Secretary, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, showed up in Kyiv, Ukraine, and put a draft agreement on minerals, on U.S. Development of rare earths and strategic minerals. He put a draft of this agreement on the table. And President Zelensky basically said, no, I'm going to take a look at this and I'm going to make some suggestions and negotiate. And so they've done that, number one. Number two, they are fighting, Tom, literally for their lives, for their existence, for the existence of Ukraine as a nation. And they're not willing to compromise. They can't compromise on that. So even if the going gets tough in these negotiations, the Ukrainians will continue to fight. They've shown that they can fight for more than 3 years. They've been fighting, I keep track, 1,125 days they've been fighting, and they'll continue on.
There's a perception, and you know, I think quite a lot of people would agree, that President Trump's pretty hard on President Zelensky, whose country you served in and whose country was invaded. The Ukrainians, after all, have played ball. They accepted the 30-day ceasefire deal, which Russia did not. Why do you think President Trump is so hard on the Ukrainian leader? Is it justified, do you think?
Tom, I think a lot of people would agree that President Trump is hard on the Ukrainian leader. Is it justified? Do you think? Well, I think So you're right, it's a complicated relationship, but it seems to kind of go up and down. Right now, they seem to be on track, in sync, on the same page, the Americans and the Ukrainians. But yes, there's a history there, undoubtedly, that comes into play. However, going forward, it is very clear that the Ukrainian interest in a just and lasting peace is the same as the interest that the Americans have for a just and lasting peace. It will provide the security to Europe, and it will provide security to the United States. It will provide benefits to Ukrainians, Europeans, and Americans. So I think the interests are what's key, and they are widely shared between the Ukrainians and Americans.
Okay, and just lastly, the United States delegation and the Ukrainian delegation held some talks on Sunday. Today, it's obviously more about the US delegation talking to the Russian delegation. We understand there are going to be more talks after those talks between the US and the Ukrainian delegations again. That suggests, doesn't it, that ground has been made, progress has been made, both in the Sunday talks and the Monday talks, for there to be talks happening again. Do you think the signs are looking optimistic?
I think they're looking good. I think it's the right next step. But you're right to point out that these conversations are steps in that direction. These conversations are not senior level. These are not, heads of state or even ministerial level discussions, except that the Ukrainians do have their Minister of Defense there. But the Russian delegation and indeed the American delegation are basically experts, and they are working on the specifics of a ceasefire, starting again with the energy, and then maybe progressing to the Black Sea. But these are step by step. We're not looking for a big breakthrough, but it's a good indication that they're making progress.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Ambassador William B. Taylor, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get more on the talks, and we can speak now to Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesperson for President Putin, who joins us now from Moscow. Mr. Markov, thank you for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. We're just hearing from the Russian representative, Grigory Karasin, and I gather you know him quite well. He is, of course, a seasoned Russian diplomat. He says the talks are progressing, quote, creatively. What do you think he means by that?
I know Grigory Karasin personally many years. He is extremely experienced. He was first deputy Russian foreign minister responsible for the post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine. And he knows personally also a lot of members of Ukrainian delegation. When he used a creative negotiation, he meaning that this negotiation go far beyond what expected. It's exactly what means, what usually we understand. It means that the topics for negotiation much more broader than it was expected. And also creativeness positive characteristic. It means this negotiation is going positively from a Russian point of view. Also creative means that American side can make some quite good suggestion from Russian point of view.
You emphasized the fact that Grigory Karasin is extremely experienced. The same can be said of Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. I know he's not taking part this time around, but we're talking about a brand new administration in Washington. And on the one hand, you've got these very experienced Russians and these very inexperienced Americans. Do you think your delegations therefore got the upper hand?
I think that Donald Trump team also very experienced, but not from diplomacy point of view. It's one of the problems that Russian side is very experienced in diplomacy, but diplomacy now is a crisis, everybody understands. And Donald Trump and Witkoff, who is his Trump personal friend and also a big businessman in New York, and they're very experienced in making the deal. They very experienced in making negotiation about the deal. And as you understand, the businessman in New York, which is very big from business point of view and very competitive area, the businessmen in New York, they're very tough, very strong, very experienced in negotiation.
The Kremlin, meanwhile, Dmitry Peskov saying we're only at the beginning of the whole process. And I'm just wondering how hopeful you are that these talks in Riyadh are going to achieve some sort of a breakthrough on the battlefield in Ukraine.
Nobody knows, but I will say you my guess. My guess is that probability of the peace deal during this spring sounds like about 25%. And but probability of the making peace deal to the end of this year already something about 65%. So this is my general impression. Now we have in the Riyadh negotiation about 3 levels of the peace. One is sectoral ceasefire, meaning stopping of attacking against energy infrastructure and possibly another kind of infrastructure. It's first level. Second level is full ceasefire, but temporary ceasefire on the 30 days. And third level is general peace deal. I think negotiation is touching the question issue on all these levels. And but of course, Russia wants to make a small step first. Also because Russia side believes that Ukrainian regime and European countries will violate those agreements. So it's better to allow them to violate on the small agreement instead of allowing them to violate big agreement.
Before I pick you up on that, there is another element to discussion there in Riyadh. They're talking about a Black Sea maritime ceasefire, which would be significant from the point of view of food exports from Ukraine. Do you think that's likely to be achieved?
You know, I don't want to say. I will tell you the truth. It's just a small trick of the Donald Trump team, because they understand that a temporary ceasefire general is not high probability, but to make a ceasefire on the Black Sea, it's very easily, because Ukrainian experts from Black Sea fleet, Black Sea ports already bigger than before the war had been started. So it's going very well. And also the situation in the Black Sea, it's not so intensive from point of view of the fight, because only Russian army has Black Sea fleet. Ukrainian attack has not, but Ukraine has a very strong army of the sea drones, which attacked Russian Black Sea fleet. And as a result, in the Black Sea, there are no military ships, because Russian military ships hide away in the Russian port under the protection, and Ukrainian army has no real big ships. So it's very easily to get the deal, the peace deal in the Black Sea. It could be very good from information point of view for a Donald Trump team. Donald Trump can report, you know, it's great. I made the peace deal for the Black Sea, but it's not so much.
Okay, so you think that's a bit of window dressing there. Moscow, of course, joining those talks in Saudi Arabia, sitting opposite a Trump administration delegation. I just want to ask you how the dynamic has changed the last 2 months in terms of relations between Washington and Moscow now that the Biden administration's gone. How different is it working with this new administration?
Of course, the great difference of this administration compared with previous administration. Previous administration of Joe Biden, in fact, was initiator of this war and main engine of those war. And this Donald Trump administration want to make the peace deal. It's very important. Also, it's very important that you touch that it's not only Ukrainian crisis between Russia and United States. Donald Trump wants to solve another issues. First of all, Donald Trump and his team wants to make the order of the Ukraine of American people, who demand, first of all, to stop possibility of the nuclear war, nuclear catastrophe. It's important direction of negotiation between Russia and the United States. And another issue is recovering of diplomatic relations between Russia and the United States, because under the Biden administration, the number of diplomats decreased almost 30 times. And I know that, for example, American diplomats who wanted to meet with me, they had a lot of difficulties to do this. And same Russian diplomats are not able to meet with members of Congress and senators and so on. This is very important direction. And if you look at the Donald Trump narratives toward this Ukrainian crisis, I think it's a narrative of the New York developing businessman. He understands that Ukrainian war is business which is not profitable, and it's the business which has absolutely no chance to be profitable. That's why to stop it and to sell this business to somebody, to Europeans or to Russians or to Ukrainians.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Sergei Markov, former spokesperson for President Putin. Thank you very much for your time. Okay, well, do stay with us here on Al Arabiya News. We're going to take a short break, but stay with us for now.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Berlin. For its exuberant urban life and vibrant art scene, visit Berlin. The German capital features a cultural scene and unique lifestyle that's both fast-paced and relaxed. Also known as the hipster city of Europe, Berlin keeps alive with its alternative cultures and styles. In neighborhoods like Kreuzberg, Neukölln, and Friedrichshain are vibrant places where locals simply chill and enjoy the relaxed open spaces and fresh air. No city in Germany is, in fact, greener than Berlin, with its forests, lakes, and sprawling parks. Berlin is also a city full of history. The World War II, after all, began and ended in the city of Berlin. Most popular are the Brandenburg Gate and the Federal Chancellery, which are reflective of the nation's rich stories. Germany's capital is also home to its major government buildings, such as the historic Reichstag or the seat of the German parliament. Of course, most remarkable are the Berlin Wall, the East Side Gallery, and the Holocaust Memorial. Historical feats aside, Berlin is also hip and happening with its streets of bars and clubs. The city has an active nightlife that guarantees massive parties and events practically every night. But the city is friendly to non-party goers too. It has relaxed beer gardens, small bars, hostels, and art galleries to suit different tastes. Famous as a city of art, Berlin has over 170 museums, including the famous Museum Island that puts treasures of the world on public display. Tourists often visit Berlin to attend ballets and operas, at the city's major opera houses, as well as witness live performances by talented orchestras such as the world-class Berlin Philharmonic. And when it comes to food, Berlin has a lot to offer too. It's a great place for vegans. It has Turkish restaurants and supermarkets everywhere, and Italian, Mexican, and Asian food spots too. Food markets offering snacks, German wine and cheese, among others, will satisfy your palate as well. The neighborhoods in Kreuzberg and Neukölln are great for finding fine restaurants and quiet lounge bars, as well as dozens of coffee bars to enjoy. When it comes to shopping, there are well-known mainstream malls to visit, alongside independent boutiques nearby that offer endless choices for your lifestyle needs. One will also find small vintage stores within Berlin, some even selling second-hand books as well as high-end designer clothing.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics, and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake, and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Now turning our eye to Turkey, where mass protests erupted across the country following on from the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul and the main opponent of President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Well, İmamoğlu, who was expected to be selected as the Republican People's Party's 2028 presidential nominee in a vote on Sunday, was instead formally arrested and charged with corruption. In response to his arrest, unrest surged on Monday night, making for the worst demonstrations Turkey's seen in more than a decade. Well, İmamoğlu has stated that the charges against him are politically motivated. He said, quote, "I will never bow" on his X account, this before being remanded in custody. Well, President Erdogan has condemned the protests, accusing the CHP party of trying to disturb the peace and polarize Turkish citizens. Well, following Ekrem İmamoğlu's arrest, the European Commission urged Turkey to uphold democratic values as both a member of the European Council and EU candidate state. Well, the EU Commission spokesperson Guillaume Mercier made this statement.
The arrest of the mayor İmamoğlu and the protesters give rise to the questions regarding Turkey's adherence to its long-established democratic tradition. As a Council of Europe member and an EU candidate, Turkey must uphold democratic values. These rights, the rights of elected officials, as well as the right of peaceful demonstrations, need to be fully respected.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Professor Ayça Çubukçu, who is an associate professor in human rights at the London School of Economics. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We've been hearing, obviously, throughout the course of the weekend, a lot of developments. The mayor of Istanbul was arrested and jailed. He faces corruption charges. He's accused of aiding a terrorist group. What do you read into the timing of all of this?
Well, the timing is critical. There's a peace process happening now in Turkey with the PKK. The arrest of the mayor of Istanbul coincided with this peace process, which is very much contested now. And it affects the dynamics on the ground, the kind of support Ekrem İmamoğlu has been able to garner from civil society and different political groups on the ground who are protesting in tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands across Turkey. The conjuncture is critical. Admittedly, is quite difficult to interpret in terms of what is likely to happen now.
Okay, let's talk a bit more about Ekrem İmamoğlu himself. He's 53 years old, mayor of Istanbul. If there was an election in Turkey tomorrow, would he win it?
He is very likely to win it. You might be aware that yesterday, about 15 million citizens of Turkey, whether they're members of the CHP or not, participated in CHP's primaries to determine the presidential candidate. And he is now the official candidate. This is an unprecedented mobilization. Members of CHP as well as non-members have mobilized themselves, have voted in the primaries, and have determined Ekrem İmamoğlu as the presidential candidate of the opposition. So what we're seeing is extremely remarkable civic mobilization all across Turkey, from the largest cities to small towns. So I think this is a remarkable turning point in politics in Turkey.
And do you think the fact that he's been arrested and that he has clearly got a lot of support behind him indicates perhaps that President Erdogan views İmamoğlu as being a serious threat?
Of course, İmamoğlu is a serious threat to Erdogan's hold on power. And as the opposition claims, and I think they are right, because İmamoğlu is such a threat to Erdogan's power, he's been targeted through legal procedures. We see law being mobilized in Turkey against all kinds of opposition figures, activists, journalists, politicians. Kurdish politicians themselves are in jails in the thousands. And now CHP is the target of what we could call lawfare by the Turkish government.
Okay, and we're looking at some of the worst unrest that Turkey's seen, certainly in the last 10 years or so. It's being reported there have been demonstrations in 55 of the 81 provinces across Turkey. That's quite a large swathe of the country. Does the government look like it could be in some sort of danger at this point?
It depends. This is an unprecedented mobilization since the Gezi uprising in 2013. We've seen nothing like this in terms of scale of the protesters, the protests all across Turkey, in terms of the determination, in terms of composition. This is a wide, let's say, coalition, for the lack of a better term, in the streets, being constituted in the streets. Is extremely diverse, and it poses a serious threat to Erdogan's power. Now, everything depends on how the Turkish government, Turkish judiciary, and the police will respond. It's as of midday today, more than 1,100 people have been arrested, detained in the protest, including students, journalists, and politicians of different persuasions, from left-wing groups to, just students who've been leading the protests across universities in Turkey. They have declared, tens of universities have declared through their students a boycott of classes, their calls for a general strike. It's difficult to guess and predict how things will unfold, but this is the most serious, I agree with many commentators, threat to Erdogan's power since the Gezi uprising in 2013.
Yeah, and if the economy was in good shape, perhaps he'd be in a stronger position. But it looks, just looking at the value of the Turkish lira as one indicator, it's now, I think today, 40 lira to €1. when it was sort of 4 lira to 1 euro about 10 years ago. The economy's in dire straits. People really feeling the pain, aren't they? And I'm just wondering if Erdogan just cuts a very unpopular figure now in Turkey.
Well, simply put, the inflation rate is off the roofs. People from working classes to middle classes have seen a drop in their standards of living. There are millions of people living under poverty, if not starvation levels. There is a serious economic crisis as felt by the people of Turkey. Clearly, this has contributed to the unrest and demonstrations we're seeing. There appears to be little hope for the future. It's not only a matter of the violation of human rights and civil rights, the situation of the economy and the real difficulties people are having just to live and subsist on a daily basis, given unemployment, given the depreciation of the Turkish lira, given the inflation rate, I think are certainly contributing to the determination and the strength with which they have taken to the streets so far.
Okay, just lastly, I mean, obviously very difficult to predict what happens next, and you've already touched on the difficulties of forecasting where we go to from here. So why don't we look backwards instead? Recep Tayyip Erdogan himself was arrested in 1999, and he then went on to become the country's prime minister and then president. He's been a mainstay for the last 22 years or so. I mean, that's a major reversal of fortunes that he had. And I'm just wondering whether there have been other examples, haven't there, of politicians who've served some time in prison only to have a dramatic reversal of fortunes and a dramatic comeback. Yeah. Do you think the same could happen for Ekrem İmamoğlu?
It could happen. We should remember that Selahattin Demirtas, the co-chair of the pro-Kurdish, then HDP party, has been in jail also, and he's now joined by Ekrem İmamoğlu. Demirtas has been behind bars for years, and it's very difficult to predict if İmamoğlu will be released, and if so, when. All I can say is that everything seems possible right now, and all depends on the determination of the people on the streets and on how the Turkish government will react in response to that in the coming days.
Okay, well, we'll keep a close eye on what happens there in Turkey. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Professor Ayça Çubukçu at LSE in London. Thank you. In other news, an Israeli airstrike on a hospital in Gaza killed a senior Hamas leader and an aide on Sunday evening. Ismail Barhoum, the head of the group's financial affairs, was killed in a strike on the Nasser hospital, which is the main medical facility in Khan Yunis. Well, he'd been receiving treatment at that hospital after being wounded in an airstrike a few days earlier. Well, Israel's military said it had struck a key Hamas member operating inside the hospital compound following, quote, an extensive intelligence gathering process, adding that precise munitions had been used in order to mitigate harm. Meanwhile, Gaza's health ministry announced at the weekend more than 50,000 Palestinians are now known to have been killed in the Israel-Hamas war, including more than 700 who've been killed since Israel resumed its bombardment last week. Well, let's get more analysis. We can speak now to Aaron David Miller, former U.S. Middle East peace negotiator, who joins us from Washington. Great to have you with us once again. It appears that the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis was struck on Sunday night. A senior Hamas figure, we're being told, was killed. What's actually left of Hamas, do you think, at this stage?
Oh, I think quite a bit. If you believe former Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who in December essentially said that Hamas had recruited nearly the number of fighters that the Israelis had taken off the battlefield over the course of the last year and a half. Look, I think the group is no longer capable of functioning as an organized military organization. Its capacity to launch high trajectory weapons, rockets, has been decimated. Maybe 50% of the tunnel structure, but probably no more, eliminated. But look, you know, the notion that you can't kill an idea, that may be true, but very little has been done over the last year and a half to make that idea less relevant. That is, to create an alternative to Hamas's abysmal governorship of Gaza and their catastrophic decision on October 7, which has led not just to their defeat on the military basis as an organized concept, but to the hollowing out of Hezbollah and the end of Hassan Nasrallah. Nonetheless, they're going to maintain themselves as an insurgency capable of influencing through intimidation or co-optation much of what happens in post-conflict Gaza.
We're being told that more than 50,000 people have now been killed in Gaza since October the 7th. I mean, when and where do you think Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will draw the line? I mean, what's his vision for peace, and does he even have one?
I don't think he has a vision for what you and I might, or most people would conclude as peace between Israelis and Palestinians, either in Gaza or, frankly, on the broader issue of what to do about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think he's driven largely by one reality. I mean, he's the most astute, willful politician, skillful politician on the Israeli scene today. At the same time, he's been on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in a Jerusalem district court 4 years in running. He must maintain himself in power. If he doesn't, he faces the possibility of a conviction, or perhaps more likely a plea agreement that would mean the end of his political career. So that means presiding, as he has since December of 2022, over the most right-wing government in Israel's history. In most everything he does, certainly with respect to Gaza, is done with a view of how to strengthen his hold on power, not weaken it.
I mean, loads was happening at the weekend in Israel. There were protests against Prime Minister Netanyahu. He dismissed the head of Shin Bet. There was a no-confidence vote in Israel's Attorney General. And I was going to ask you whether Netanyahu's position looks weak and whether those actions should be viewed as him somehow trying to shore up his position. What's your interpretation?
Well, no, I think the resumption of the war is critically important to keeping its coalition intact. I mean, you've seen that the decision on January 18 to accept the Israel-Hamas agreement basically led to the leaving of the government by Itamar Ben-Gvir. Bezalel Smotrich, the other extremist minister in the Prime Minister's coalition, agreed to stay only if the Prime Minister resumed the war. So I think the battlefield is connected to the political field. And right now, the Prime Minister has a budget to pass. If he doesn't by the end of March, the government will fall. He has an ultra-Orthodox conscription bill, needs to figure out a way to manage. And as you pointed out, he's already taken action to fire Ronen Bar, unprecedented in the history of Israel, that any Shin Bet director, several have resigned, but none have been fired. And he's laying the groundwork for getting rid of the Israeli Attorney General. For all of this, he needs a strong, coherent right-wing coalition. So I think that's his priority right now.
I mean, there are, of course, those 59 hostages who remain in Gaza. We don't know exactly how many of them are alive, but we can assume probably at least 20 of them. I mean, in terms of going about getting them released, I mean, what is Benjamin Netanyahu's best course of action? Because he seems to have veered quite considerably from that roadmap that was drawn up by the Egyptians and the Qataris.
Yeah, well, the most charitable, well, as far as the roadmap is concerned, that the three-phased agreement that the Biden administration conceptualized and negotiated, and the Trump administration in the several days before his inauguration pushed over the goal line. The notion that Israel and Hamas would ever be able to implement a phase two, I think, was never in the cards. The hope, of course, was that if you had 6 weeks of quiet, maybe Israeli and Palestinian publics would press their respective leaders for a cessation of the war. Obviously, that did not happen. And I think the most charitable interpretation, and I use the word charitable, it's sort of an anomaly given the fact that so many Palestinian civilians have been killed just in the resumption of this recent Israeli offensive. But the most charitable interpretation is that the Israeli government has upped the pressure on Hamas to get them back to the negotiating table. And there are reports this morning, as you know, out of Cairo, per Egyptian sources, that Hamas has agreed to a proposal to release 5 hostages in exchange for a resumption of the ceasefire. That's the most charitable interpretation. I think, frankly, in terms of avenging the dead or redeeming the living, that Mr. Netanyahu is much more focused on figuring out a way to continue the war against Hamas, to try to eradicate it as a military organization. And I think it's going to be difficult, to say the least, but to end its political influence in Gaza. I think that's his priority because, frankly, that priority coincides very nicely with his political interests.
I mean, hundreds of Palestinians, more than 700, have been killed since Tuesday of last week. I mean, clearly, that ceasefire deal that we were just talking about there hasn't had the desired effect, certainly not in the last week or so. Who's to blame, in your opinion?
Well, I stopped doing that very long ago after working on these issues over the last 27 years on the broader issues, not of war making, but of peacemaking. Look, I think there's one basic reality here that external parties need to accept, and that is the limitations of their influence. When two parties, in this case, the current Israeli government and Hamas, are engaged in conflicts that they consider to be existential or near existential for both of them, either from a security point of view or from their own political interests, the role of outside parties, the influence, the pressure that they can bring is really quite limited. And frankly, the international community has been feckless, divided, self-interested, basically incapable. And I might add that the Arab world has not shown itself with rare distinction either. They have presided over the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza without doing anything, either to break their relations with Israel or even pressure the United States to get tougher with the Netanyahu government. So everybody has a hand in this, but the two primary combatants, Hamas started this on October 7th. We wouldn't be having this conversation had they not decided to engage in this, just this millennialist notion that somehow if they could inflict a degree of pain on Israeli civilians unprecedented in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which they managed to do, that somehow the region would explode. Arab governments would be under pressure to break their ties with Israel. The Iranians and the Israelis would get into a major war that would plunge the Middle East into chaos and confusion, and Hamas would claim credit somehow for I don't know what. So Hamas started this, but it played into the hands, clearly, of an Israeli government that had no intention, in my judgment, of ever being serious with respect to negotiating a broader Israeli-Palestinian agreement. The last time we tried to do this, the last best chance, I'm saying this not because I was one of the 12 Americans who participated in it, because it was the last time that an empowered Israeli prime minister, a president who really cared about this, and a Palestinian leader who actually had control over the Palestinian national movement engaged in an effort to push for a permanent deal on border security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims. And by the end of that summit at Camp David in July 2000, the gaps between Israelis and Palestinians were as wide as the Grand Canyon. The suspicion, mistrust greatly accelerated, and nothing that has occurred in the last 24 years has done anything other than expand those gaps. So you talk about responsibility, it's never one hand clapping.
Just to pick up on one of the things you said that stood out for me, you said, you know, that was the last time there was a president who actually cared. You're obviously talking about a US president here. Are you suggesting President Trump doesn't care about the situation in Gaza?
Look, I think Donald Trump's conception of the national interest is subordinated, or of the American national interest, is subordinated and tethered to his own interests, financial interests, his politics, his vanities, his pet projects, his grievances. So do I think Donald Trump cares enough to actually focus in a way that would be required of any US president, the way Jimmy Carter focused, the way George H.W. Bush focused, the way Bill Clinton focused, even the way Barack Obama focused, which was not nearly as intensely as the other three, certainly not as much effort was expended as was expended by Carter and Clinton. No, I don't think Donald Trump, I don't think that's his priority. It's domestic in large part, and it's trying to figure out a way to get a quick deal to end the Russia-Ukraine war, to normalize relations with Vladimir Putin. And I think if you had to ask me about the relative importance of Gaza in comparison with that, I think Gaza occupies very little of the president's attention. Should he be interested at some point in an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal, which would win him a Nobel, at least that's, I suspect, what he thinks, then perhaps, for that reason, he may be able to bring the kind of focus that is required, but certainly not now.
Well, he did have a plan, a very original one for Gaza. Unfortunately, not many people in the region particularly appreciated it. But on that note, the Israeli government has announced some plans for a special agency, which is going to be for the, quote, voluntary departure of Gazans. I'm just wondering, this is my last question to you, what you think that's about, and should we join the dots and see a link between that and what President Trump proposed, which was to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East and for Gazans to go live somewhere else?
Trump's proposal, in my judgment, wasn't serious. I mean, it sent a lot of people in the region scurrying around trying to figure out how to avoid responsibility. The Egyptians at an Arab summit basically put on the table, a 90-page plan, probably prepared by some consultancy, which the Trump administration reacted in a kind of lukewarm manner, and the Israelis danced around it. They didn't like it either. So no, I think Donald Trump's notion of turning Gaza into the Riviera by displacing its inhabitants never made any sense. This idea on the Israelis, which essentially builds on some of the ideas that Trump put out there, I don't think is serious in the sense that it could actually ever be implemented. I do believe, however, that the Israelis will try to determine how many Gazans might actually want to leave. I don't know what that number is, but it's, again, part of the notion that the only answer in the minds of certainly many right-wing Israelis is a whole new configuration, either to empty Gaza of its inhabitants or alternatively to create a situation where the Israeli military, because there's no security architecture there, and I don't think anything is on the cusp of being created that would replace the Israelis, and they're not going to withdraw their forces in the wake of October 7th, to somehow turn Gaza into a sort of free fire zone. I don't think they want to militarily occupy it. Yes, there are many in Israel, I suppose, on the right who would like to see Gaza resettled after Ariel Sharon, the late Ariel Sharon, withdrew Israeli forces and dismantled the 8,000 settlers and the settlements there in 2005. But no, I think this Israeli government has no real plan that in the end would redound to better governance in Gaza, more security, And most important, Gaza first, not as Gaza only. That some solution to Gaza would give way to a broader negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I don't see that happening anytime soon, and I certainly don't see this Israeli government committed to advancing any part of it.
But if there's no food and no humanitarian aid entering Gaza, and the Israeli government's got ideas like this to resettle people, I mean, it's very hard to look at those two facts independently of one another.
I think that's right. And I think any of the scores of plans by think tanks, governments in the Arab world, in Europe, in the US, to basically create a soft landing. And again, I use that word not to trivialize the amount of death and destruction that Gazans have suffered over the course of the last year and a half. It seems hard for me to imagine because you have three huge obstacles that stand in the way. What or who is going to replace the Israelis with respect to preventing Hamas's resurgence? Number two, who or what is going to replace Hamas? And number three, what to do about the very real tragic situation of an entire generation of Palestinians who have been scarred by what has happened over the course of the last year and a half, the physical destruction, not to mention the emotional and psychological destruction of what's occurred. And I don't have answers. And frankly, I don't think anyone has good answers to overcoming those three problems. And that's why I think the situation there is going to get worse before it gets worse.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you, Aaron David Miller. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.